Hello all. Welcome to the Kant lecture. The lecture tonight will be about Immanuel Kant and his moral philosophy. So I might have warned you going into this reading that Kant is no fun to read. This is tough business. This is about as tough as it's going to get this semester. I don't think there's anybody who's harder to understand or harder to read than Kant. So throwing fastballs at you really early, but because Mill wasn't exactly fun to read either. But you can rest assured that some of the hardest stuff is right up front, and so probably going to be downhill from here. Let's talk about where Kant is coming from. First of all, let's do a little review. We talked last time about consequentialism and Mill's utilitarianism. Now, remember, utilitarianism was the moral philosophy that says an act is good to the degree that it promotes happiness and bad to the degree it promotes misery. So, moral decision-making on this account is all about happiness and the creation of happiness, right? And we talked at the end of last lecture about why it is that some people historically have had some misgivings about utilitarianism. Remember I said, and this will weigh on our minds going forward as we talk more and more about the differences between the different moral philosophies. But remember I said, one of the biggest concerns that non-utilitarians have about utilitarianism is the degree to which utilitarians are comfortable forcing sacrifices onto some smaller group of people or some person as long as it benefits the greater good, right? And this seems to fly in the face of a lot of people's moral intuitions about things like human rights, for instance, right? Utilitarians are pretty comfortable to one degree or another. As I said, there's different versions of utilitarianism, but to one degree or another, they're pretty comfortable violating a person's alleged individual rights as long as it's for the greater good, right? Like in the example of the old West Sheriff, for instance, you sacrifice one to save the many lives, right? So this idea of forced sacrifices is the sort of biggest of the objection historically that's been raised against utilitarianism. But from Kant's point of view, we don't even get that far. There's an even more basic problem that Kant and the Kantians have with utilitarianism as a moral philosophy. That objection is that happiness has not one little tiny thing to do, they say, with good moral decision-making, right? For a Kantian, morality is about duty. Our moral duties maybe they create happiness, maybe they don't create happiness, who cares? Happiness is meaningless, right, to a Kantian, right? So the objection that a Kantian would level first and foremost about the problems of utilitarianism and the problem of people like John Stuart Mill might go something like this. Here's a thought experiment that can be used as an alleged proof to show that utilitarianism is just wrong from the word go, as long as that word is happiness, right? So here's a thought experiment to make the Kantian position on happiness and morality clear. Imagine this. Imagine there are two parallel universes. And in these parallel universes, we're familiar with the concept of parallel universes that are exactly alike in every way. There's a counterpart of you, a counterpart of me. This guy looks just like me. He's called Jason in that universe too. He teaches philosophy and so on. And in this thought experiment, there are parallel universes where there's two guys exactly alike their counterparts. You get to name them. At this point, I would go through the crowd to pick a name. I don't have a crowd. My assistant Beth, however, will give me a name of this of the young man in this example.
Fredo.
Fredo. Good. A Godfather reference. I'm going to marry this girl. So what we have here is Fredo, and we'll call the first one Fredo 1 and Fredo 2. So here we have Fredo 1 in this universe, Fredo 2 in this other universe. They're exactly alike in every way. They look alike, they act alike. They have the same biography. Now, the biography goes this way. Fredo, in both universes, was born to a very poor family, but he had a good mind from a young age. And so he worked really hard and got into a really prestigious college when he went off to college. While he's at college, in both universes, Fredo meets a young lady. We will leave a name of a young lady. Gina. Okay. Perhaps a Brooklyn Nine-Nine reference. I like it. Okay.
Is that a ponytail?
Yes.
Okay.
Gina 1 and Gina 2. Okay. So, in both universes, Fredo meets a young lady. Her name is Gina. She's exactly alike in both universes. You can tell she's a girl because a young lady because of her skirt and the curl in her hair. Yes, these are sexist drawings. I apologize. Anyway, but Gina in both universes has exactly the same biography as well. She is the only child of a fabulously wealthy family. We're talking billions with a B, right? So she she's used to the good life. She's born, again, in this very rich family. In both universes, Gina meets Fredo. In both universes, they date and they get married, right? And they have children, right? Now, unfortunately, in both universes, Gina, at a very young age, contracts a rare form of cancer. And by age 30, after having a couple of children, she's on her deathbed, right? It's an inoperable cancer, right? In both universes, Gina, as her dying, surrounded by her family, she says to her family, well, I've had a very short life, but don't cry for me. It's been the short life that I've had couldn't possibly have been any happier. So my life story is not a tragedy just because I'm dying young. I've had as much happiness as anybody could enjoy, right? Then after giving this moving speech, she takes her final breath and she dies, right? And after she takes her final breath, in both universes, Fredo becomes independently wealthy. Now, these are two stories, two universes exactly alike in every way, in every detail, down to every atom, all except for one difference. Fredo 1 loved Gina, and Fredo 2 only ever wanted the money. Now, a Kantian might say, who do you like better? Explore your feelings, look into your heart, and ask yourself, which universe do you like better? The universe where Fredo loved Gina, or the universe where Fredo loved just wanted the money and lied to his wife the whole time. Now, let me answer for you. I can't hear you. Or I think off in the distance I can hear you screaming the answer. The answer is, well, of course we prefer, just intuitively, our common sense tells us, our moral intuitions tell us that, of course, we prefer the universe where Fredo loves his wife, right? Now, the Kantian would say, put your utilitarian hat on for a second. Pretend you're John Stuart Mill and answer this question. Which universe do you prefer? Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and the rest of the utilitarians. Do you prefer universe 1 or universe 2? Well, your answer to this has to be based on the amount of happiness in each universe, right? There's no other question when it comes to moral decision making. And here is where a utilitarian runs into maybe into a problem, maybe a very trenchant fundamental problem. And that's this. Not only is the utilitarian hard-pressed to explain why in the world we should prefer universe 1 to the other universe, they're, on the face of it, at least equal with regards to the amount of happiness in each universe. In fact, the problem gets even worse. You could make a utilitarian case that we might prefer universe 2, right? Do you see why? Well, over here where Fredo loved Gina, he's devastated when she dies. He doesn't get out of bed for a month, right? He's in misery, right? So there's a lot of unhappiness when she dies over here, right? Over here, when Gina dies, Fredo, he goes out and he buys a Bugatti and he feels all better, right? So this is an indication, especially the Kantians, that utilitarianism is wrong long before we get to the problem of forced sacrifices or sacrificing people for the greater good. It's wrong at a more fundamental level. It's wrong because it doesn't take into account intentions, right? The reason why we prefer this universe to this universe 1 to universe 2 is because of intentions, right? Over here, Fredo has good intentions. He loves his wife. In universe 2, Gina's whole life is a lie, right? She's lived a happy life, but it's all been a lie. And we prefer a universe, intuitively, we prefer a universe with good intentions, even if it means less happiness, than we do a perfectly happy universe where we are living in sort of this blissful ignorance of what people are really up to, right? As I said, when we talked about utilitarianism, they're a lot less concerned about intentions. John Stuart Mill says, hey, if you save somebody from drowning because out of the kindness of your heart, versus somebody who saves somebody from drowning because the drowning person is rich and the person saving him expects a reward. Mill says, what's the difference? Doesn't really. You've done well regardless of your intentions. The intentions don't really matter to Mill, and Kant couldn't disagree more. Right? Intentions are all that matters. Right? So now we're talking about Kant. Intentions matter, but what are the right intentions to have? Here's where it gets tricky. It's time for more bad art. Pause this while I draw. I don't want to waste anybody's time. Okay, so now intentions matter, but what are the right intentions to have? It's important for Kant that you not just do the right thing, but you have to do it for the right reason, right? So let's imagine this situation. Let's say that you are sitting there watching TV. This is you sitting on your couch, right? Here's your TV, right? You're hanging out just on the weekend, watching TV, having a good time. When you look out your window, you see across the street your elderly neighbor, right there, struggling to get up her front steps. She's carrying very heavy bags. She's got bad posture. She's an elderly woman. She's not in good shape. Those steps are very jagged and hard, right? So what do? Well, here's what you do. You stop watching TV, you get up and you go across the street and you help your elderly neighbor carry her heavy bags up the front steps. Now, if we're talking about utilitarianism, we don't need to know anything else. Boom, you did good. You get a gold star, right? You helped her, she smiled, she was happy, she didn't hurt herself, etc. So for John Stuart Mill, we don't need to know anything else. But now we're talking about Kant, and we need to know the intentions. We need to know the reason why it is, the reason or reasons, why you stopped what you were doing, got up off your couch, and went over to help, right? So at this point, we in class we brainstorm about what some of the reasons might be. What are some reasons? Well, these are the common reasons that come up. People will say, well, you want a tip, right? Maybe the elderly lady is well-to-do. Maybe she has poor eyesight and can't tell the difference between a 1 and a 20. And you expect that, hey, you might get a tip for helping. So, a tip. Some people say, well, maybe she's good at baking, right? Maybe she makes delicious desserts, and you expect that if you help her out, she will make you a delicious dessert. So, dessert. Another motive that comes up is people will say, well, maybe there are neighbors down the street that you're trying to impress. There's a young lady or a young man who you want that person to think that you're a good, kind-hearted human being, so you want to impress your neighbors, right? Often when we're brainstorming, this happens. Somebody will raise his or her hand and say, helping is just the right thing to do, right? And to this, I often pigeonhole a person, right? I'll try to say, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean you're going to feel guilty if you don't help her up the front steps? And often the student will kind of back away and say, yeah, okay. You're going to feel guilty if you don't help her, right? Other people say, well, what goes around comes around. I believe in a karmic thing, so if I do a good deed for somebody in a kind of cosmic sense, good things are going to happen to me. So good karma. Put that down too. Some people say, well, it feels good to help people. I enjoy helping, right? Feels good to help. And here at this point, a student, maybe the same student who spoke up earlier, stewing over the issue for a little bit, will raise a hand again and say, now wait a second. I don't mean that I feel guilty. And I don't mean that what goes around comes around. And I don't mean that it feels good to help. Darn it, it's just the right thing to do to help the elderly neighbor up the front steps, right? Now, I have made a little column of the motives that we might have. I'm going to need to make a new column for this other reason. Just the right thing to do. Now, I put this in a different column for a particular reason. Because this is the controversial one. We all agree that these motives exist. We all agree that people do things for these reasons. That you might want a tip, you might want a dessert, you might want to not feel guilty, and so on. But do we do things like helping people just because it's the right thing to do? Or is it's just the right thing to do code for one of these other hidden motives, right? Now, this is at the heart of a dispute, one-sided dispute, but a dispute that Kant had with another philosopher named David Hume, who was a contemporary of Kant's, right? Hume was a very important, very, very progressive kind of thinker, way ahead of his time. And Hume espoused a form of what we might call, what we might say is kind of an early form of the utilitarianism that Mill would espouse a century later, right? Hume is not a utilitarian, but he espouses a kind of moral attitude that we consider a kind of precursor to the era of utilitarianism. What he said most importantly that inspires utilitarianism and really, really drives Immanuel Kant up a wall is Hume thinks that all of our loftier reasons for doing things, for doing good deeds, are really just cover stories for selfishness. That we, at the end of the day, we are, whenever we do any deed, we are really doing it just for selfish reasons, right? Some of those reasons are more obviously selfish than others, but ultimately, Hume thinks we're not capable of doing anything, literally not capable of moving our bodies, unless we first have some sort of need or emotion or desire to motivate us. And these desires always boil down to some sort of selfish desire, right? And now you can see over in column 1 that ultimately all of these desires are reducible to some sort of selfish reasoning, right? Obviously, some of these are more mercenary than others. If you want a tip or you want a dessert or you want to impress your neighbors, those are obviously very clearly selfish reasons to do things. But what about the other ones? Like you don't want to feel guilty, or you feel good. It feels good to help people. We normally think that, hey, if you're motivated to help because you would feel guilty otherwise, or if you feel, you do something because you feel good whenever you help people, we normally think, well, that's a pretty good reason to do things. That's probably a good person, a well-raised person, right? But Hume points out, and might have a point here, that, well, yeah, but still, you're just trying to alleviate your guilt, or you're just trying to feel that rush of pleasure that you get from feeling good about yourself for helping others, right? So from Hume's point of view, all of our reasons for doing things are ultimately selfish, which means that human beings are not capable of even a single moral action, right? At least not moral in the traditional sense of something that is done selflessly, just for the benefit of others, right? Hume said that would be impossible. This drove Kant crazy. Kant really had a problem with this, and Kant really set out to prove that human beings were capable of acting strictly selflessly out of a recognition that moral duty demands that we act, right? Hume thinks that it's just the right thing to do is an impossibility. This is just a cover story. This is just a lie we tell ourselves, and the real motives are one of these other reasons. Kant wants to show that actually, no, we are capable of doing something simply because we recognize that duty demands it, right? So, okay. To make Kant's case about getting off your couch to help your neighbor up the front steps, think about it this way. I erased the list of motives. But remember all the motives that we might have. You might want to feel good about yourself, you might want a tip, you might want a dessert, and so on. And then off to the side on its own is this other possible motive that it's just the right thing to do, right? Now, Kant's analysis of this is a quick proof that Hume is wrong, and that we aren't only motivated by selfish actions. Might go this way. Look at all those selfish motives. Guilt, the need for a tip, dessert, and so on. What if you don't feel guilty about not helping your neighbor? Is it still the right thing to do to help her up the front steps? Well, yes. What if she doesn't give tips? Is it still the right thing to do to help her up the front steps? Well, yes. What if she doesn't make desserts? What if you don't feel good about yourself? What if you don't care about impressing your neighbors? You can cross off every one of those other motives. Is it still the right thing to do to help her up the front steps? And the answer intuitively is yes. And Kant says, aha, there we go. We are capable of doing something just for the reason that we recognize that it's the right thing to do, right? So now we're going to get a little more technical in Kant's psychology, right? And we're going to have to introduce some terminology here. Because we want to know, so we have decided, Kant thinks so far, Kant thinks he has proven that we are capable of acting just out of duty, right? Just out of a recognition that something is the right thing to do. But that doesn't tell us what our duties are. That doesn't tell us what the right thing to do is, right? And now he's going to dig into that. And this is where things get a little more technical. So in the first case, Kant, he introduces the concept of what he calls an imperative, right? An imperative is it's when my reason tells me I must act, right? So we are constantly, as we move around the world, we are acting on these little imperatives, these little psychological imperatives. Now, there is one kind of imperative that is totally uncontroversial and we all recognize. And this is what Kant calls a hypothetical imperative. And this is a conditional command of action. A conditional is an if-then statement, right? So a hypothetical imperative commands me to act by saying, if you want this, then you must do that. So, an imperative is when my reason tells me that I must act. We got a little bit of a glare here.
Yeah.
So, reason tells me I must act. Oh, that helps. A little.
That usually helps a lot. Okay.
There we go. Reason tells me I must act. And how does the reason do this? Well, one way it does this is through what Kant calls a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is a conditional command that has the if-then formulation. It tells me that if I want this, then I must do that. For instance, my wife might say to me, if you want more ice cream, then you must go to the store, right? In other words, she's eaten all the ice cream again. Now, answer me this. Am I going to go to the store to get more ice cream? Or am I going to go to the store, right? Well, you don't know because you have to know something about Jason. You have to know something about my desires, something about my subjective universe, what's going on inside of me. What if I don't want ice cream? Hard to imagine. But imagine maybe I'm not in the mood for ice cream. Maybe I'm on a diet. Maybe I'm pre-diabetic and I'm watching what I eat. Whatever, right? A hypothetical imperative, it tells me I must act if I want some outcome, right? And if I don't desire that outcome, if I don't care about that outcome, then the hypothetical imperative doesn't move me. It doesn't get me off the couch, right? And we can think about this in lots of ways. We're constantly acting on hypothetical imperatives, right? If you want to pass this class, then you have to listen to these lectures and you have to fill out the quizzes. Now, are you going to listen to these lectures and fill out the quizzes? Well, it depends. Do you want to pass the class? The hypothetical imperative doesn't say you simply must do this. It says you must do this if you want this other outcome, right? Now, again, not a controversial thing. We're very used to this idea. But here we run into the disagreement between Kant and Hume again. From Hume's perspective, all there is to our lives are what Kant calls these hypothetical imperatives. We're constantly out there moving around trying to get things for ourselves, strategizing about how to get the things, what to do to get the things that we want, right? Kant's question then is there a different kind of imperative? Because these hypothetical imperatives, they are morally worthless, right? There is no moral value to any hypothetical imperative. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad to act on a hypothetical imperative. We have to all the time. But if you're acting on a hypothetical imperative, your action has no moral value at all, right? For instance, take my example of the ice cream. Let's say I go to the store and I get some ice cream, and I enjoy, some ice cream, right? Now, is that a morally good thing? Well, I don't know. I mean, if we're strict utilitarians, maybe I've given myself some pleasure. So maybe I have done something that's at least a little bit morally good. But normally we think, well, no. I mean, deciding what to eat is not on the face of it anyway, is not a moral action, right? Deciding whether or not you're going to pass this class is not on the face of it a moral action. It might be wise if you want if you want a grade, you want credit, and you want to go on to achieve your 5-year plan or whatever. But if you decide you don't want to, I mean, it isn't necessarily morally bad. It doesn't seem like it has moral value at all. So it doesn't show up on the moral radar. And Kant thinks that any hypothetical imperative that we ever act on, it just doesn't have moral worth. It doesn't show up on the moral radar. If moral action were possible, if it were possible to perform a moral action, a morally good action, it would have to be motivated by a different kind of imperative. It would have to be motivated by an imperative that's unconditional. Doesn't have an if-then formulation. Doesn't say, hey, if you want this, then you have to do that. It would say instead, you must do this, period. You must, or if you prefer, you must do this simply because it is the right thing to do. This would be a different kind of imperative, not a hypothetical imperative, not a conditional imperative, but an unconditional imperative, what Kant calls a categorical imperative. So, if moral action is possible, it would have to be motivated by what Kant calls a categorical imperative. This is an unconditional command of action. It tells you must do something simply because it is the right thing to do. That's what a categorical imperative would be. But what is, let's say if there is a categorical imperative, what does it tell us about what the right thing to do is, right? And here's the magic act that Kant is kind of famous for. He thinks that a categorical imperative, is built right into the very idea of a rational being. That the very idea of rationality, human rationality, comes with it a certain kind of moral duty built right into it. In a way similar that, a triangle has 3 sides, right? If you make a closed geometric figure with 3 angles, built right into that is going to be that it also has 3 sides. Human beings come with a moral code that's built right into the very idea of rationality. How does that work? Good question. Okay, so to talk about what what our duties are with regard to the categorical imperative, we have to introduce some more technical terminology. And this is a very, very important concept, maybe the most important concept in Kant's philosophy, and that is the idea of a maxim. Maxim. Now, be careful with this word. Kant uses this word maxim in a very peculiar way, a very peculiar and technical way, and the word maxim, the way he uses it, won't show up in a standard dictionary. It might these days if you Google it, right? Google's pretty smart. But a maxim in normal English usage, a maxim is a little saying that has some sort of moral, right? It gives some sort of advice, like all's well that ends well, right? Or a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, right? Or these are maxims. These are old sayings that have some little moral meaning, some little bit of advice, right? Forget all that. For Kant, he uses the word maxim in a different way. A maxim for Kant is going to be the policy or principle that underlies an action, right? So Kant thinks that we are constantly acting on maxims. His idea of maxims is very close to the idea of intentions, right? So we're constantly walking around acting on these little principles, these little policies, and as we act on them, we are committing ourselves to them, right? And I can always state the maxim of my action if I say what I'm doing plus why I'm doing it. That will equal the maxim of my action, right? So take any action. What did I do today? Well, I got out of bed. Why did I get out of bed, right? Well, I got out of bed. That's what I'm doing. I got out of bed for the purpose of starting my day, right? So the maxim of my action is I will get out of bed for the purpose of starting my day. Then I had breakfast. I had breakfast for the purpose of gaining sustenance for the day. So I will eat breakfast for the purpose of gaining sustenance, right? I prepared some, a quiz and some lectures, some lecture notes, right? Why? Well, for the purpose of doing a good job, and so on and so forth, right? Or not a terribly exciting life these days, right? So, crucially, human beings are capable of thinking about our maxims before we act on them, right? I can stop and think to before I get out of bed, I can stop and think to myself, well, what am I about to do? I'm about to get out of bed. Well, why? For the purpose of starting my day. Should I do that? Right? Maybe I should roll over and go back to sleep, right? Maybe I should sleep in, call in sick, whatever, right? So this is crucial for Kant because what Kant draws from this is that, well, some maxims are better than others, right? And we're capable of thinking about our maxims before we act on them, and we're capable of choosing which maxims we're going to act on and which maxims we're not going to act on, right? This is crucial for Kant because what he thinks this does is, logically, this means that when I choose to act on a maxim, I have committed myself to that maxim being acceptable, right? I have, in effect, given my stamp of approval to that maxim, right? And if I can give that stamp of approval, logically, I ought to be able to say that that maxim is good, period. That it's not just good for me in my specific situation, but it's good for everybody similarly situated, right? Throughout time, throughout space, all human beings, all rational beings. If I can say that it's a good maxim that I acted on, I ought to be able to say that it's good, equally good for everybody similarly situated, right? So let's play. Now we're getting somewhere, right? Because now what we have is effectively a test for our maxims. That we can run our maxims through this little test before we act on them. We can ask ourselves, well, can I really give this maxim my universal stamp of approval? Could I say that this maxim is good for everybody to do, right? Now, let's go through my day again. I got out of bed for the purpose of starting my day. What if everybody always got out of bed for the purpose of starting their day? That sounds good. I ate breakfast for the purpose of gaining sustenance. What if everybody always ate breakfast? Well, it's the most important meal of the day. That'd be great, right? I prepared, some my lecture and some quizzes for the purpose of having a good job. What if everybody always prepared to have a good, did their due diligence to do a good job during their day? That sounds good, right? Now, let's say later on today, it's getting late in the day for this kind of thing, right? But let's say tomorrow I wake up and after I get out of bed and after I eat breakfast, I decide that I'm going to go to my bank. I'm going to write on a piece of paper, I have a bomb, fill this bag with money, and I'm going to rob my local bank, right? Now, we talked about this example. A lot of my students point out that I'm preoccupied with robbing banks. The truth is, I kind of am. It just always seems so easy, right? But anyway, but I would never rob a bank. I'm not going to say anything, right? But I do fantasize about it sometimes, right? Nothing violent, just a little note in the baseball cap and everything, and you walk out with some money, right? It happens a couple times a month, and people just get away with it. Anyway.
Not that you're encouraging that behavior.
Not that I'm encouraging that behavior. It's just, Anyway. I have a boring life, and I have a rich fantasy life. How about that, right? So, anyway, so we all agree, intuitively, common sense, that robbing banks is wrong, even in this sort of non-violent way, right? But what exactly is wrong with robbing banks? Here's an important distinction. Kant and Mill both agree that robbing banks is seriously morally wrong, but they totally disagree about why. Yesterday, or the other day, in my Mill lecture, I gave the example of robbing banks, and I walked through the sort of cost-benefit analysis of all the pain and misery versus happiness and joy that is caused by robbing a bank, right? And what we decided was that the little bit of joy and pleasure that I get from robbing a bank and from having robbed the bank is offset by the relatively large amount of misery that's created by the bank employees and the police and the entire community, right? And so for Mill and the utilitarians, what makes robbing banks wrong is that it creates massively more unhappiness than happiness, right? Now, for Kant, he agrees that robbing banks is wrong, but he has a totally different reasoning, right? And his reasoning has, of course, nothing at all to do with happiness, right? Kant thinks about it this way. He says, okay, well, what's the maxim of your action, Jason? Your maxim is, I will rob banks for the purpose of getting money, right? And Kant wants to know, well, if you're going to act on that maxim, you are committing yourself to that being a good maxim. Can you really say that that's a good maxim? And the test for that is, well, what if everybody always robbed banks to get money? If you can say that it's good for you, you ought to be able to say that it's good for everybody similarly situated. So what if everybody, anytime they needed money, they went and they robbed a bank, right? Now, the first pass at answering that question often comes back, well, it would be chaos. It would be like the Old West. People would constantly be robbing banks, and then nobody really wants to live in a world where everybody's always robbing banks and everything, right? And that's an important point. But there's a more fundamental point that Kant would make, and this, and sometimes my students will point this out, and that is that, now wait a second, if everybody always robbed banks every time they needed money, nobody would keep their money in banks, and there would be no banks to rob, right? And for Kant, this is the core of the matter. This is the heart and soul of what makes things like robbing banks seriously morally wrong, is that if everybody did it, it would not be possible to do it. So it's not possible to give your true, honest, logical endorsement to that maxim. You can't really say, nobody can really say that robbing banks to get money is a good maxim to act on, because you can't universalize it. You can't say it would be good if everybody always did it. And you can't say that because if everybody always did it, then there'd be no banks to rob at all. They simply wouldn't exist, right? To give a little more realistic example, consider this. I often have students who are of traditional sort of college age, so they're between 18 and 22, right? And if things haven't changed much in the last 20 years since I was of college age, what you often get for people of that age is you often get credit card offers in the mail, right? You're constantly getting credit card offers from Visa and MasterCard and so on, right? And now the truth of the matter is, hey, there's a $5,000 credit limit. Have a ball, right? Just sign on this dotted line, right? Promising to pay back at a certain interest rate the money that that you take out, right? Now, the truth is there's no debtors' prisons in the U.S. anymore, at least not officially. I'm going to blow the lid off of an open secret here, but in case you don't know, you can just take those credit cards, spend $5,000 on a new laptop or on buying meals for all your friends, run up your limit, and then just not pay them back, right? Lots of people do it. Now that'll ruin your credit, at least for a certain amount of time. Here's a pro tip. Eventually credit card debt just goes away and they can't even ding your credit anymore. Takes years and years, but it happens. So you can just run up these credit cards and with no intention of ever paying them back. And if you don't mind getting angry letters and you don't mind people debt collectors calling you all the time and making empty threats about how they're going to ruin your life for years and years, then why not? Why not go out, get a credit card, and use that to get your a new stereo system or a new laptop or something, right? Now, let's analyze this from a utilitarian and from a Kantian perspective. From a utilitarian perspective, I don't know, is it wrong to take out a credit card with no intention of repaying it? Who's really hurt by it? First of all, you have a great time, you and all your friends that you're buying expensive meals for, right? But who's really hurt by it? Visa, HSBC, these big banks. Do they really cry themselves to sleep at night because some 18-year-old didn't pay back the $5,000 that she took from them? No, not really hurt by it, right? So I think there would be you could make a utilitarian argument that stealing, but it's not like stealing from a person, right? It's not like robbing your neighbor, or anything like that. Who's really hurt by it? The utilitarian might ask, right? Now, from Kant's perspective, of course, no. You may not do this, and you may not do this for the obvious reason that if everybody promised to pay back credit cards, if everybody signed up for a credit card and had no intention of paying back the credit card, there would be no credit cards. If nobody paid back their credit cards, the banks would not offer credit cards, and it would not be possible to get a new laptop by taking out a credit card with no intention of repaying it, right? Or repaying the debt, right? So from Kant's perspective, you have done something. You have done the worst kind of crime here. You have committed yourself to a bad maxim, right? You have violated the most basic moral law. The most basic moral law is the categorical imperative. And now we can say what the content of the categorical imperative is, what the categorical imperative really tells us about what our duties are. And we do this by formalizing this universalization test that we've talked about. So, okay. So now let's talk about the content of the categorical imperative. Kant, of course, loves his terminology, he loves this sort of technical talk and this jargon. What we are about to do is we are about to talk about Kant at his absolute worst when it comes to jargon, right? Kant says that there is one categorical imperative. There is one universal moral duty that we all have, right? And then he goes on to give 4 different versions of it that don't seem to say the same thing. So it's not clear in what sense Kant thinks all of these versions of the categorical imperative are equivalent to each other. This would be a great topic for a PhD thesis if you want to go on to pursue a career in philosophy. This is the kind of thing that professional Kantians, and there are professional Kantians, just pull their hair out, right, about. I had a full head of hair before I started reading Kant, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 2 versions of the categorical imperative, and we're just going to treat them as though they're equivalent. They, in some sense, say the same thing and are totally compatible with each other, glossing over the fact that lots of people think that they aren't necessarily totally compatible with each other, but that's beyond the scope of this class, as they say. So, okay. So, the first version of the categorical imperative, we're going to call the universal law formula. Now, this is the most famous version of the categorical imperative, and when people talk about Kant's categorical imperative, this is the version they mean, and often this is just called the categorical imperative. But for the purposes of being clear about our terminology, I'll refer to this as the universal law formula. And all this is going to do is it's going to formalize the little rule that we extracted earlier about the nature of the relationship between maxims and reason, right? And what this says is that we should act on no maxim unless we could will that it become a universal law, right? So this amounts, again, to a kind of test for our maxims. Before we act on any maxim, we should ask ourselves, well, what if everybody always did this for this reason, right? You should be able to say, if your maxim is good, you should, well, before you act on any maxim, you should always ask yourself, would it be good if everybody always did this for this reason? Now, there are 2 ways that you can fail this test. Okay, so the first version of the categorical imperative says that we should act on no maxim unless we could will that it become a universal law. Put another way, what this means in regular talk is that you should never ever do anything unless you could honestly say that it would be good if everybody always did that for that reason. Okay? Now, there are 2 ways that your maxim might fail this test. Like say you're thinking about robbing a bank, and you're asking yourself, well, should I act on that maxim, right? So there's 2 ways to fail. In the first case, when you universalize your maxim, and you think, well, what if everybody always did that for that reason? You realize that you can't even imagine a world in which that maxim is universal, right? That built into the idea of the universalization of the maxim, there is this logical problem. This happens with robbing the bank, for instance. There wouldn't be banks to rob. It happens with the credit cards. Well, if everybody always took out credit cards with no intention of repaying them, there wouldn't be credit cards. So you can't even really imagine, consistently anyway, you can't even really imagine the world where everybody always did that for that reason, right? Kant, just to be forewarned, Kant is a real fanatic about never lying and always fulfilling your promises, right? So just to be clear, the issue with signing your name on, to a credit card would be a special problem with him, because he thinks if you pledge to do something, you have consensually taken on this commitment that is absolutely binding and non-negotiable, right? So, and we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about your commitments to your promise, fulfilling your promises, and whether or not it's ever okay to lie when we go a little bit later when we talk about some controversies and problems with Kant's moral theory. So anyway, the second way to fail, that your maxim might fail the test, the universalization test, is that, well, you can imagine a world where everybody always acted on that maxim. But if you were being honest, you wouldn't want to live in that world. And in fact, no rational being would want to live in that world. So Kant gives a couple of examples here. One of them is racist. That's always fun. 18th century philosophers being racist. The examples he gives here is, well, imagine a world where everybody's lazy. Nobody ever develops their talents, and they just sit around and they just amuse themselves in sort of cheap ways. And Kant's example here is, imagine the Polynesian Islanders, right? What if everybody was like the Polynesian Islanders? This is the racist part. Those Polynesians, all they do all day is they sit around in their little grass skirts and they play their little ukuleles and they just, have sex in the surf and they just waste all of their time. And, they aren't engaged in any sort of, work or any sort of craft or anything like that. And Kant says, well, what if everybody was like that? Well, we can imagine a world like that. We can imagine a world where nobody ever developed their talents or worked hard for, because they just wanted to entertain themselves all day. But Kant says nobody wants to live in that world, right? No rational being would want to live in a world where nobody ever develops their talents, right? If you spend so much time being lazy, sitting around playing video games or whatever, that you develop a blood clot, a deep vein thrombosis, and you have to have surgery, right? You hope when you go to have the surgery that the surgeon has developed her talents for surgery and hasn't just spent her day, playing Red Dead Redemption or playing some video game, right? You want to be surrounded by competent people who have developed their talent, and so Kant thinks that this creates a kind of duty to be the sort of person that you want to see in the world, right? His other example is of a very stingy millionaire, right? Say there's some self-made man who's created some business, and he feels like nobody ever helped him when he was coming up, and so when his friends come around, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation comes around for charity or seed money for somebody's business, he says, well, get out of here, right? Nobody ever helped me coming up, so you do it the way I did it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Now, Kant thinks that we can imagine a world where everybody always had that attitude. Nobody was ever kind to each other or charitable with each other. But nobody, Kant says, wants to live in that world. Not even that stingy millionaire wants to live in a world where nobody is ever kind to each other. And Kant thinks that if that businessman were really being honest, he would have to admit that there were some people who helped him along the way, right? Two ways to fail the universalization test. One of these ways is a more serious failure than the other. The first one is a more serious failure. Kant says if you universalize your maxim and you realize that you cannot consistently even imagine a world where everybody always acted that way, full stop, never, ever, for any reason, not even one time, act on that maxim. This creates what he calls a perfect duty. A perfect duty never to act on that maxim. And what this will amount to, in most cases, mostly, is prohibitions on certain kinds of actions. There are going to be certain things that we may never, ever, ever, ever do for any reason, right? Killing innocent people, making promises with no intention of fulfilling those promises, lying. As it's going to turn out, we have a perfect duty never to lie. It's going to be a very controversial part of Kant's theory, right? Anyway, the second way to fail results in what he calls imperfect duties, right? They're imperfect. They can't be perfect prohibitions or perfect duties in the way the first one was, because there's just not enough there's just not enough hours in the day to, for instance, fulfill all your talents. Go back to that, the idea of, we don't want to live in a world where everybody's lazy. What we want to live in, the world we want to live in is a world where some people develop their talents to help make the world a better place, right? Now, this leaves open the question, however, of which of your talents to develop. Nobody can perfectly develop all of his or her talents, right? If you want to be an astronaut, you're probably going to have to give up your dreams of being a concert pianist. There's just not enough hours in the day, right? So you have to sort of pick and choose what kind of person you're going to be. We have standing orders to be kind to each other, to help each other out, right? We can't be perfectly kind all the time to everybody in every way. There's just not enough time for that, right? If I can't lend all of my money to everybody. I have to pick and choose which of my friends or which charities are in the most need, right? What we can consider for this for the second kind of failure is that this generates what Kant calls imperfect duties. You have to, and you can consider these as kind of standing orders, right? That if you decide that you want to be in a world where people develop their talents, where people are basically kind to each other, where people help each other out and so on, you should consider it a standing order to be that kind of person, right? Now, it might be that other sorts of concerns or other sorts of duties interfere with your ability to do that all the time, and that will be the case. You can't develop all of your talents. You can't be perfect. I can't lend $500 to a friend of mine if he really needs it, if I've already promised that money to my landlord for that month's rent, right? We have to pick and choose, right? But we should consider that we have kind of standing orders to be the kind of people that we want to see in society, right? Okay. Wait, there's more. In fact, and I said we were going to talk about two versions of the categorical imperative. We will now talk about the second version of the categorical imperative. Okay, so let's talk about the second version of the categorical imperative. This one is, it's meant by Kant, it's presented by Kant to be a little easier to apply. The universal law formula, it can be a little abstract and a little difficult to apply in some cases, and a little mathematical. So the second version of the categorical imperative is meant to kind of simplify and complement it, right? So this version, categorical imperative, this is version 2. It's called the practical law formula. It's also known as the formula of the end in itself. I might refer to it as the formula of the end in itself. Same thing. But what it says is this. Now, this is going to make zero sense the first time through, but once we cash out some of the terminology, it's actually going to turn out this one is a lot easier to apply. So what this says is, we should always treat everyone as ends in themselves and never as a mere means, right? Or as a means alone, right? So what in the world is that nonsense? Well, all we have to do is cash out some of this jargon, and it's going to snap right into place. So, okay, so let's cover some of Kant's jargon here. So, when he says we should always treat everyone as an end in themselves and never as a mere means, what does all of that mean? Well, let's talk about some of those words. A means in this context is a tool or a strategy that I use to get something. So this marker is a tool that I use. I use it to write notes on the little dry erase board. Right? It is a means, right? Now, what am I trying to do with this tool? Well, what I want is I want notes on the board, right? That is my end. An end is a good or a goal that I'm trying to accomplish, right? So this marker is a means to an end. It is a tool that I use to get notes on the board. My car is a means to an end. It is a tool that I use to get my butt around town, right? Now, we are surrounded by, we human beings, we love our tools. We love our little devices and our little technology. And we are absolutely surrounded by means to ends, by things that we use to get something, right? Now, most of the tools that we use, they only have instrumental value. That is, they help us accomplish some specific goal, and they're only good to us insofar as they help us accomplish that goal, right? This marker is only good to me if it helps me get notes on the board. If it dries up and I can't write with it anymore, I throw it out and I get a new marker, right? It has absolutely, if it can't help me get notes on the board, it has no value to me whatsoever. If my car breaks down, I get a new car. It would make me sad because of the money it costs me, but I'm not sentimental about my car. I don't have a funeral for it. I don't write a love poem about how much I miss it, right? I just throw it out and I would get a new car, right? Which means that most of the tools that we're surrounded by, most of the means that we're surrounded by are mere means, or means alone. They strictly have instrumental value, right? And it doesn't make any sense, it wouldn't make any sense to say this marker is great. It's all dried up and it doesn't help me write on the board, but it's just a great marker. No, the only value that the marker has is as an instrument. It doesn't make any sense to say I have the greatest car in the world. It doesn't drive and it's up on blocks in my front lawn, but it's the best car in the world. No, it's only good if it helps us fulfill some purpose, right? Now, there are, however, some things in the universe that have value regardless of whether or not they are good for any sort of instrumental reason, whether or not they are useful for any other purpose. Here's what I think. Take a show of hands and say who can think of something in the world that has value strictly because of what it is. Strictly, it has an inherent value regardless of its use for another purpose. That would be something that is an end in itself. It is a good or a goal in and of itself, right? Can we think of anything in the world that is a good in and of itself?
Art.
Anyone? Yes. Ms. Murphy.
Art.
Art? Well, maybe we can think of a few examples. Art is an example some people bring up that maybe, beauty, something that represents beauty, is valuable strictly because it represents a certain kind of beauty, right? And there have been, since Kant has been around, since the age of Kant, there have been modern Kantians who have tried to expand Kant's idea of things that are ends in themselves to include other things, right? Some people have, some modern Kantians have tried to say that have argued that the natural world, for instance, might be an end in itself. And we often, especially in the environmental movement, we treat the natural world as though it is a thing that is good in and of itself. Regardless, the mountain is good regardless of whether or not there's, gold that can be extracted from it. We should just not mess with it, right? Kant thinks there is one category of thing that is an end in itself, and that is you and me. That is people. Specifically, rational beings. We have value because of our status as rational beings. And because of our status as rational beings, we have this extremely high inherent value, right? Now, what is the point of this? What is the import of this? Well, what this means is that human interactions, for Kant, are fraught. They are morally dangerous, right? Why? Well, because we are constantly in positions as human beings of having to use each other for things, right? I'm going to pick on the bank teller again, right? When I get my paycheck, believe it or not, I'm paid for this. I take my paycheck down to the bank. I sign it, I pass it to the teller, right? I'm using her as a means to get what I want. No matter how much I beg them, they will not let me hop behind the counter and get my own cash out of the register, right? So I have to use the bank teller to get what I want. What I want is my money, right? So I'm using the bank teller as a means to an end. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, from Kant's perspective, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as we understand at the same time that we're using each other, that we also have this, we understand our instrumental value to each other, but we also need to always respect, always keep in the forefront of our minds that we have, in addition to our instrumental value, this very, very high inherent value as ends in ourselves. And in all of our human interactions, we need to make sure that we are fully respecting our status as ends in ourselves, as goods in and of ourselves, right? How do we do this? Well, in the first case, let's make it clear how we don't do it, how we run afoul of this rule, right? And the fundamental way to treat somebody not as an end in yourself, but rather as just a means or just an instrument or a tool to get what I want. The main way to do this is by denying people the ability to consent to being used, right? And this for Kant is why passing my signed paycheck to the teller and then getting my money, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Passing a note to the teller that says, I have a bomb, fill this bag with money, that's a problem. We've already seen one sort of way of thinking about why it's a problem for Kant. But there's another dimension here that makes it wrong for Kant, and that is that I am using that teller not as a human being. I'm not respecting her value as a human being. I'm using her strictly as a means to get what I want, right? I haven't asked her if she would like to be robbed. I haven't, asked her if she would like to be part of my little plan to get some cash. I have just said, hey, lady, give me the money. I don't care if you're scared. I don't care if this is how you didn't want your day to go. Cough it up, right? So I'm not treating her like a human being. I'm treating her like a vending machine. I'm treating her like she's just something to get me what I want. And I'm doing this by denying her the ability to consent to be part of my plan, right? The two typical ways that we deny people the ability to consent to our plans and that we use people as mere means is by using force to get the things that we want. Sticking a gun in somebody's face, using threats, making somebody an offer they can't refuse, so on and so forth. The other way of denying people the ability to consent is through deception or lying, right? That if instead of passing the bank teller a note that says I have a bomb, let's say that I forge a check, right? And I fool her into giving me cash that shouldn't be mine, right? Well, Kant says I've done basically the same thing there. I have used her in a way that has denied her the ability to consent to what I was really up to, right? So for Kant, we may never, ever, 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 not even one time, use each other without a person's consent, right? And that's what it means when he says we should always treat everyone as ends in themselves and never as mere means or means alone, right? So this version of the categorical imperative is very, very popular with modern audiences. Modern Kantians really dig this version of the categorical imperative. It's not as bloodless or mathematical as the universal law formula. And this idea of emphasizing consent in human interaction sounds very good to our modern ears, right? So a lot of modern Kantians have really put a lot of emphasis on the second version of the categorical imperative. In my ethics reader, for my ethics students, there is an article in there by Onara O'Neill that's a great compliment to the Kant section, and it's called A Simplified Account of Kant's Ethics. A little too simplified, I'd say, but within a couple of pages, she lays out the second version of the categorical imperative and says really great things about it, right? Kant is never capable of doing anything halfway. He's a fanatic about everything. And so there are a couple ways in which this second version of the categorical imperative turns out to be a little bit controversial. The main way is that Kant thinks that we can never use people without their consent. We can never benefit from our use of people unless they have fully consented to that, right? Which sounds okay, but it also creates some somewhat strange situations. There are some cases we can think of where I might use somebody without his or her consent that seem pretty trivial. For instance, let's say that I think O'Neill uses this example, but let's say that a city decides that they're going to put in a special sidewalk, that the friction of people walking along the sidewalk is going to help generate electrical power for the city, right? That seems like a good thing. It seems like maybe it's environmentally friendly and so on, right? Kant, however, thinks that what we're going to need is we're going to need a sign. We're going to need to put a sign up that says, hey, if you walk down the sidewalk, you are consenting to helping power the city. If we don't put up that sign, from Kant's perspective, well, we may as well shoot those people that are walking down the sidewalk. He's really that much of a fanatic. He thinks that what's wrong with all wrong action is the same basic thing, and that is the violation of the categorical imperative. We think of there being sort of different levels of crime, that it's worse to, kill you than it is to steal from you. But from Kant's perspective, he doesn't truck in those sorts of nuance. You may never violate the categorical imperative, and if you violate the categorical imperative, you're doing something as bad as killing people, right? So he's a bit of a fanatic, right? Furthermore, another thing that we might want to say about this version of the categorical imperative that I think modern writers really sort of want to downplay is the fact that Kant, in laying out the practical formula, says that he specifies that we should always treat everyone, ourselves and others, as though they are ends in themselves and not as mere means, right? So he goes on to emphasize again the role of consent in making sure that your interactions with people are on the moral up and up. But it's a strange sort of detail that he throws in. We should always treat everyone, and he specifies ourselves and others as ends in themselves. Because if consent is the beginning and the end of the story of treating somebody as a mere means, it doesn't seem reasonable that I could possibly treat myself as a mere means. I mean, presumably I'm consenting to what I'm doing to myself, right? And this is made absolutely clear in Kant when he begins to get into his examples of violating the categorical imperative. This is one of the problems with reading Kant. His examples meant to elucidate what he's talking about. They are famously, notoriously terrible, right? His examples only make they don't make things easier to understand. They only make things more complicated, right? So his first example of the violation of the categorical imperative is suicide. He says that we may not commit suicide. Now, how does this run afoul of the, forget the first version of the categorical imperative. How does this run afoul of the practical formula? How am I treating somebody as a mere means if I kill myself, right? Clearly I'm acting with consent. But what exactly am I doing wrong for Kant? Well, from Kant's perspective, what I'm doing is I'm treating myself as though I am, think about why we typically commit suicide. Typically, I commit suicide because I'm in some, deep emotional pain. I might also commit suicide because I'm afraid of something that's going to happen to me, right? I'm captured by some enemy forces, and I'm afraid I'm going to be tortured or something, right? So I kill myself, right? So from Kant's perspective, I'm treating myself as though I'm just a vessel for suffering, right? For happiness and suffering, right? And I'm denying the fact that I have this very high inherent value, right? And I can do that even if there's nobody else in the room, right? By destroying myself to avoid suffering, I am denying my very high inherent value, right? You can imagine this is not something that's terribly popular to talk about with modern Kantians. And maybe doesn't really make any sense at all. Another way that we might, consenting adults might treat each other as mere means is, through prostitution, right? As you might think that Kant, with his emphasis on consent, might be okay with prostitution. Let's imagine an ideal situation of prostitution, right? There are no pimps involved. There's no sort of blackmail. There's no drug addictions involved. There's no human trafficking. Let's just imagine a situation where a person would like to make some cash, another person would like to have sex with person B would like to have sex with person A. They prearrange a price, and they go and they have this mutually consensual encounter, right? So what's so wrong with that? Well, from Kant's perspective, what's wrong with it is that those people don't understand that their bodies and that the sex act has this very, very high natural inherent value. And what they're doing instead is they're treating each other as though their bodies are just there to amuse each other, right? They are using each other just as vessels for pleasure. And so this exchange, consensual though it might be, is mutually degrading, right? They're degrading themselves and they're degrading each other, right? This, once again, this line of thinking has kind of not aged well. It's interesting that Kant is such an influential and revolutionary thinker. He, by the way, is, I think it's safe to say, the most important philosopher who is in Greek. He's of monumental significance in the history of philosophy. He revolutionized not just ethical theory, but also epistemology and metaphysics. So he's, strong case to be made that he's the most important philosopher of the modern era. That said, though, a lot of people have pointed out that for all the original thinking that he did, isn't it interesting that when it comes to his ethical theory, he ends up coming up with a very elaborate philosophical justification for exactly the same sort of Lutheran morality that he was raised with as a child, right? It turns out that everything that he thought as a child was morally wrong, lying, not fulfilling promises, hurting people, and so on and so forth. Well, surprise, surprise, after this long, very, very elaborate, non-religious sort of philosophical project, well, as it turns out, all of those Protestant values that he was raised with, they just make sense, right? No God needed, right? It's just, all of those are just sort of built into our reason, right? The philosopher Nietzsche described Kant as an animal that breaks out of its cage but then crawls back in at night to sleep, right? Kant, he's this thinker he's so revolutionary and sort of free thinking and able to think about all these issues in this very original way. But at the end of the day, you can't quite let go of the morality he was raised with, right? Okay, so that said, so those are the basics of Kant. A lot to it. Let's now talk a little bit about the controversies, the problems with Kant, or the problems that have been raised over the years with Kant, right? The most controversial thing about Kant's moral philosophy, I think it's safe to say, has to do with lying. It turns out that lying, and this is specifically any instance of looking someone in the eye and saying yes when the answer is no, or vice versa, active lying, active deception. For Kant, any version of lying, any reason for lying, fails the categorical imperative violates the categorical imperative in the most fundamental and basic way, right? In fact, you're violating both versions of the categorical imperative. In the first case, if I lie to you, and everybody always lied in that situation, then you would not believe my lie, and lying would offer no advantage in that situation, right? To lie is to attack the very idea of truth for Kant, right? Furthermore, if I'm just to underscore and highlight it, I'm also violating the second version of the categorical imperative, because if I'm lying to you, I'm denying you the ability to consent to what I'm really up to the truth, right? So if I, say, hey, I need to borrow some money because I need to pay my rent this month, and instead of using it for that, I go to the casino with it, right? What have I done? Well, I lied to you to get the money, and the reason I lied is because I knew if I told you I wanted to work on my new blackjack system, you wouldn't have lent me the money, right? So if everybody always knew that people lied in that situation, they wouldn't believe the lie. And by denying you the ability to consent to what I'm really up to, I've done something as bad, Kant thinks, as strangling you, as killing you, right? So what's wrong with that? Well, on the face of it, I think a lot of people have a problem with the idea that there could never, ever, even in theory, be a good lie. First thing that comes to mind is white lies. We can all think of cases where a lie seems to be harmless, and in some cases, maybe even a good thing. Maybe even we would like to be lied to, right? So, for instance, say my wife comes to me and says, hey, what do you think of this hat, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, it looks great, baby, right? I like your hats, don't. She's not a hat person. That's why it shows that article floating. So what have I done there? Well, I've lied because I want to spare her feelings, right? I don't want to hurt her feelings, and I don't want to maybe feel bad about myself, make her feel bad. If we would normally fight about this, but you can imagine somebody maybe being assaulted, and maybe causing a fight, And a lot of my students, especially my married students, have pointed out that maybe marriage is runs on certain little white lies that are harmless and just meant to hurt people's to maintain people's feelings, right? Furthermore, we can imagine a situation where I would want to be lied to, right? A few years ago, I planned a surprise party for one of my good friends, right? That required a whole elaborate series of lies to plan and get him to the spot of the surprise party, right? Now, when everybody yelled surprise, did he feel betrayed? Was he angry? Did he think I'd rather be dead than have been lied to and fooled these past couple of months? Well, no, he was thrilled. He loved it, right? And full disclosure, I would love a surprise party. Little hint, right? I had a surprise wedding once, and that was wonderful. True story. That worked out great, right? So I think my friend was thrilled to have been lied to in that situation. I wouldn't mind being lied to in that situation. Is it wrong to lie to him? Well, it should be clear from Kant's perspective. There's no such thing as a white lie, right? Don't lie about the hat. Don't tell little white lies to resolve people's feelings. Don't throw surprise parties for people. None of this for Kant is worth it. All of this is undermining. Not only is it violating the categorical imperative, but in a more practical sense, it's undermining the very idea of truth. Right? That it's teaching people that we should not expect the truth whenever we ask a question. Right? So Kant's a fanatic about lying, right? And so far, we might just, shrug that off and say, well, this is just one of those things we would have to accept if we want to be Kantians, right? Maybe on balance, Kant has a more plausible moral theory than Mill did, right? There's another problem, though, with this issue of lying. What about a case, can you think of a case, where not only is it more your intuitions, your common sense tells you, not only is it okay to lie in that situation, but actually you do something seriously morally wrong if you tell the truth. So normally in class we played this game for a while, and people bring up examples. But to cut to the chase, the most trenchant example of this relates to the case of Anne Frank, right? Anne Frank famously was a 14-year-old Jewish girl who lived in Amsterdam. When the Nazis invaded in the 1940s, they were rounding up, of course, all the Jews and shipping the Jews off to concentration camps, right? Which were not pleasant places to be. They, in effect, made it illegal to be Jewish. And it was a law that you had to turn in Jewish neighbors, right? The Gestapo would go around and they would ask, do you know any Jews? Do you know anybody who's hiding any Jews, right? So Anne Frank's father uses business contacts to hide out in an attic above a shop, right? Spoiler alert, the Frank family ends up being ratted out. Nobody's really sure who did it, but they end up being ratted out, and they are in fact shipped off to concentration camps. And Anne Frank dies at age 15 of typhus in Dachau. Anyway, one of the concentration camps. Imagine this situation, though, right? Imagine you are a Jew, or not a Jew. Imagine you're a German, a good German person in Nazi Germany. You don't like the Nazis because you're a Kantian. Kant would not be crazy about the Nazi regime, right? But you're a good Kantian Jewish person, German person. Your Jewish neighbor comes to you and says, please, can you help me hide my family? I don't want to be shipped off to a concentration camp, right? Now, as a good Kantian, you have a duty to help preserve innocent human life. So you say, okay, you can live in my attic or live in my basement or whatever, right? And you hide your Jewish neighbors, right? Then the Gestapo comes along, knocking on doors, and they say, do you know anybody who's hiding any Jews, right? Well, what is a good Kantian to do, right? I hid my Jewish neighbors up in the attic, right? But now the Gestapo is asking me, do I know anybody who's hiding any Jews? I do. I am. And they're right upstairs. What can I do? I can't lie, right? Do I have to say, okay, well, right this way. They're right up there, right? Turn left. Now, this problem, this issue was known to Kant in his own day. He didn't know anything about Nazis yet. That was 150 years before, he was around 150 years before the Nazis were a thing. But it was pointed out in Kant's own lifetime by one of his contemporary critics that, okay, Kant, what about this scenario? What about, you're sitting around one day and somebody comes to your door, knocks on your door, and he's got an axe on his shoulder, right? And he says, hey, have you seen your neighbor? I just was over at his house. He wasn't home. Thought he might be around here somewhere. I'd really like to bury this axe in his skull because, I don't like him, right? And I'm tired of his business, right? Now, you happen to know that your neighbor is in your backyard picking carrots. You let him into your garden sometimes to pick carrots. So, Kant, what are your moral duties with regard to this would-be axe murderer and your innocent neighbor? Can you not lie to the axe murderer? Do you have to say, oh, yeah, okay, so the neighbor's in back. It's right around the way, go back. They're on the path. You got to jiggle the gate a little bit. You'll find him back there. He won't see you coming, right? What do you do, Kant? Kant, he stuck by his guns. He responded to, very famously, some would say infamously, he responded to this critic by saying, well, you can't lie. There are other options. You could explain to the would-be axe murderer why murder is wrong. You could try to change the subject. You could you could say nothing, right? Just stare at him and blink, right? What you may not do is lie. You may not tell him, oh, I haven't seen my neighbor, don't know, go away, right? In fact, Kant doubles down, as they say. He says, actually, if you do lie to that would-be murderer, then you are responsible for any bad thing that happens as a result of your lie. If, for instance, Kant says, the axe murderer walks off in a different direction than he would have normally and happens to encounter your neighbor who is then trying to sneak away, and then he murders your neighbor, Kant says you should go to the gallows along with the axe murderer because through your lie, you created this little universe that shouldn't exist, this little lie universe, and then you're responsible for what happens in that little universe, right? Now, this has not aged well, obviously. This very issue takes on new life after World War II, when lots and lots of good people were put in a position of having to hide out their Jewish neighbors and lie to the evil Gestapo, right? And lots of people in Kant's very homeland began to rethink the question of whether or not there is a good lie, right? Because it's important to note, none of Kant's strategies to get rid of the axe murder are going to work with the Gestapo, right? The Gestapo says, "Do you know anybody who's hiding any Jews?" And you just go blank, blank, right? Or you try to lecture the Gestapo about the evils of Nazism. That's not going to work, right? You're going to end up probably going to the concentration camp along with your Jewish friends. So this is a major sticking point for trying to bring Kant into the modern era and make him sound good to modern ears. How to do that? Well, I think a lot of modern Kantians just basically ignore it or just sort of shrug their shoulders. Kant was just he was a fanatic. He was a fanatic about promises. He was a fanatic about lying, and he was. You just have to look past that and look at the good of his theory and forget about some of the bad. There was an article written about 20 years ago by a philosopher named Christine Korsgaard that tackled this very issue, and I think tackled it did very well to sort of get around this issue. And Korsgaard's argument is that, well, Kant just got his own theory wrong, right? Kant just, he was too much of a fuddy-duddy about lying, too sort of preoccupied by that. And he should have looked at it this way. Here's the real way to look at it. Remember I said there were two fundamental ways, two standard ways of treating people as mere means. And that is by lying and by using force to get what you want, right? Well, Kant in various places treats lying and using force as basically the same thing, right? And he's perfectly willing to admit that there are cases in which you have to use force, you are required to use force to help protect innocent life. The example I give in my classroom is typically, hey, I can't kick people, right? I can't, karate chop people or punch people. It would be wrong for me to do that, right? But let's say that, we're in class one day and somebody comes in with the chainsaw and is going to hack up some of my students, right? Well, under those circumstances, to protect innocent life, then I can, kick out, use my mad kung fu skills to disarm the chainsaw murderer, right? Normally, it would be wrong to punch people in the face, but not in this case. And what the difference is that somebody has initiated force, and to preserve innocent life, I had to meet force with force, right? So Korsgaard's argument is, well, there it is, right? There's your answer to the Anne Frank problem, Kant. All you have to do is say that, well, lying is a kind of use of force, right? And to protect innocent life, I can meet force with force, right? If it were, now think about it this way, confronted with the Gestapo, right? I would be perfectly justified to shoot the Gestapo officer. That wouldn't be wise. I'd certainly be arrested. But if just in that moment, to get Anne Frank out the back door, I had to use physical force, including murder, it's perfectly compatible with Kant's theory that I would be justified in using force to protect innocent life. It doesn't make any sense that I could shoot him, but I couldn't lie to him, right? We should just think, Korsgaard says, of lying as one kind of use of force. And therefore, it would be, under almost all normal circumstances, wrong. More circumstances even than we normally think. But it would be wrong in exactly the same way, under exactly the same circumstances, for exactly the same reasons as using force, right? We shouldn't do it lightly, but that doesn't mean we can't ever do it, right? So, password. Good point. The password today is blue, the color of my Powerade. So that's the attendance password for today. Email that to me. I will count you as present. Thank you. Thanks to my lovely assistant, Beth, for reminding me of that. Right. Nice hat. Anyway, so that is Kant. So if you have any questions, any comments, email them to me or participate in the discussion board. And take it easy out there, okay? Over and out.